When did a ghost from your past threaten everything you built? It still makes my stomach clench, even after all these years, thinking about that phone call. The one where I had to choose between the only shot I had at a real future and throwing it all away for a ghost. A ghost named Ralph Miller, who I hadn't seen in over 2 decades, whose sudden reemergence threatened to torch every single thing I'd painstakingly built from the ashes of my own screw-ups. The ethical dilemma wasn't just hypothetical. It was a physical weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe in the stale air of my cramped, half-finished office. I was Alexander Garcia, 38 back then, though resilient survivor felt more like a hopeful aspiration than a description. My resilience was mostly born of necessity, a grim determination to keep pushing forward because the alternative was staring at the wall in my parents' basement. We were a lean team, practically just me and the endless pots of coffee, trying to build something from nothing on the periphery of the bustling State University campus. Synapse AI was the name, and it sounded a lot grander than our reality, a tiny rented space in a dilapidated building across from the Science Quad, an echo chamber where my wildest dreams and most crushing anxieties bounced off the peeling paint. The dream, in essence, was a learning algorithm for personalized education. Imagine a student struggling with calculus getting bespoke lessons tailored to their specific learning style, their personal pace, even their preferred examples. I'd poured every dime, every waking hour, every shred of my dwindling savings into it. My days were a blur of caffeine-fueled coding sessions, frantic grant applications, and even more frantic attempts to network with anyone who'd give me 5 minutes. My social life had withered into sporadic texts with old college friends, mostly about shared memories from a time when life felt less like a high-stakes poker game. My brother, Douglas Miller, 64M, was the reason I was even on the campus, though he'd never admit it was a direct hand-holding exercise. He was a tenured professor in the computer science department, a towering figure of academic achievement, always immaculately dressed, always with a new research paper or speaking engagement to brag about. Doug was the kind of sibling who, even when he was ostensibly helping you, made sure you knew exactly how much effort it cost him. Pulled strings, he said, to get me the initial, barely affordable space, and had dropped a few carefully worded suggestions to some of his contacts about my promising little project. Every time he did, it felt less like support and more like a subtle reminder of my own perceived failures, a contrast to his glittering success. He saw my startup as a hobby, a quaint, ambitious diversion that might perhaps one day yield a mildly interesting case study for one of his doctoral students. His encouragement was always laced with a patronizing air, like he was humoring a child who insisted on playing with real fire. "Alexander," he'd said during one of our infrequent strained lunches in the faculty dining hall, picking at a salad with surgical precision. "Are you sure this isn't just another one of your diversions? Remember the cryptocurrency venture? Or the sustainable mushroom farm?" He'd smiled, a thin, almost imperceptible curl of his lips that never quite reached his eyes. Those were interesting conceptually, but lacked execution. I'd just gritted my teeth and taken a large bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly, trying to project an air of calm confidence I didn't feel. "This is different, Doug. This is real. We're on the cusp." "The cusp of what exactly?" he'd countered without looking up. "Another 5-year plan with no tangible results. I'm merely trying to manage expectations, Alexander, for your own good, and dare I say, for the Miller name." The Miller name, that was the other ghost in the room always. Our family was a tangled mess of secrets and unspoken resentments, a carefully constructed facade over a foundation of sand. Doug, the elder brother, had always been the golden child, the one who navigated the complexities of our parents' expectations with effortless grace, achieving everything they'd ever dreamed for him and more. I, on the other hand, had always been the wild card, the one who questioned, who rebelled, who ultimately fell from grace in a spectacular public fashion during my own college years. A story that was whispered but never explicitly told. Our only other real employee, if you could call her that, was Ruth Ryan, 31F. Ruth was technically my administrative assistant, but spent most of her time on her phone, expertly navigating the labyrinthine world of campus gossip and local drama. She was a whirlwind of brightly colored scarves and oversized sunglasses, her fingers perpetually flying across her phone screen. Ruth knew everything about everyone, from which professor was having an affair with a grad student to the best place to get a double-shot espresso without waiting in line. That phone call, the one I'd been dreading for 20 years, finally came just as I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn line of code, the screen casting a pale, clinical glow on my face. It wasn't Ralph himself, of course. It was an anonymous hospital administrator, voice flat and efficient, explaining that Ralph Miller, my father, had been found in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, unresponsive. They'd found my number in an old, crumpled wallet, tucked away amongst some faded photographs and a single foreign coin. Next of kin, Shed said, an echo of a designation I hadn't claimed since I was a teenager. The ethical dilemma wasn't just hypothetical. It was now a stark, undeniable reality staring me down from a hospital room. Ralph, the ghost I'd referenced in my mind, was corporeal again, and suddenly, inescapably, my responsibility. My stomach didn't just clench, it dropped out entirely, leaving a hollow ache. Synapse AI, my fragile, nascent future, felt impossibly distant, a fleeting thought overshadowed by the chilling certainty that my past, the one I'd buried so deep, was clawing its way back to the surface. I spent the next few hours in a daze, the hospital fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. Ralph was stable, they said, but unresponsive. a severe stroke. The doctors painted a bleak picture. Long-term care, likely permanent disability, no insurance, no assets, no next of kin other than the estranged son who hadn't seen him in over 2 decades. The silence in the small consultation room was deafening, punctuated only by the distant wail of an ambulance. The Miller name that Douglas held so sacred, the one I'd worked so hard to distance myself from, now tied me irrevocably to this frail, unconscious man. Ralph, a brilliant but erratic astrophysicist, had abandoned our family when I was 16, disappearing without a trace, leaving a gaping void that my mother never truly recovered from, and a bitterness in Douglas that had hardened into a permanent scowl. My own public fall from grace in college, the one whispered about but never detailed, was intrinsically linked to his disappearance, a desperate, misguided attempt to find him that had instead found me in a different kind of trouble entirely. The choice was clear yet agonizing: abandon the man who'd abandoned me or sacrifice the precarious stability I'd built to care for him. The latter felt like a betrayal of my own hard-won future, the former a moral failing I wasn't sure I could live with. I eventually signed the papers allowing for his immediate care, a decision made more from a numb sense of duty than any residual affection. Synapse AI, for the moment, was secondary. 2 weeks later, the smell of antiseptic had become my unwelcome constant companion. Ralph was still in a specialized stroke unit, a shell of the man I remembered, his face gaunt, a tube in his nose. The financial burden was immediate and crushing. Every spare dime from Synapse AI's meager funds, money earmarked for essential equipment and a crucial marketing push, was now diverted to his care. My coding hours dwindled, replaced by endless phone calls to social workers, insurance companies or lack thereof, and palliative care specialists. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was building an AI to personalize education while my own life became a crash course in the labyrinthine complexities of elder care. Ruth, surprisingly, was my only constant. She still spent most of her time on her phone, but now her calls seemed to be less about campus gossip and more about finding obscure grant programs for family caregivers or tracking down the best-priced medical supplies. My grandma had a stroke last year. Shed offered one afternoon, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "It's tough, Alex, really tough. But there are resources, you just gotta know where to look." She even brought me coffee, real coffee, not the sludge from our office machine, on my bleary-eyed visits to the hospital. Her transformation was subtle, born of a shared humanity rather than any professional obligation. She still knew all the campus gossip, but now it felt like a byproduct of her existence, not its primary focus. She was the one who found a pro bono legal clinic that specialized in navigating medical debt, a small yet significant relief. Douglas, predictably, was less understanding. He'd arrived at the hospital one afternoon impeccably dressed, his usual air of detached academic superiority amplified by the sterile environment. He stood at the foot of Ralph's bed, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "So he's back," he'd stated, the words flat, devoid of emotion. The prodigal father, he hadn't called Ralph dad since the day he left. "And you're shouldering this burden, Alexander." He walked out, he chose his path. "Let him lie in it. He's my father, Doug," I'd responded, my voice tight with exhaustion and a simmering resentment that had been festering for years. "And he's an old, sick man. What else am I supposed to do? You're supposed to focus on your future," he'd countered, his voice rising but still controlled, always controlled. "On Synapse AI, on the Miller name. This is a distraction, a colossal drain. It's exactly the kind of emotional indulgence that's held you back your entire life." He'd looked at me then, a sharp, piercing gaze. "Do you know what he did? The shame he brought upon us, it nearly destroyed Mother. And you running off, getting into that situation, trying to find him. It set you back years, Alexander. Years." His words, though harsh, struck a chord. My ill-fated attempt to find Ralph after he disappeared had indeed led to my expulsion from college, a scandal that cemented my status as the family's black sheep. It was a wound that never truly healed, and now Ralph's presence ripped it wide open. Douglas was right in a way. This asterisk was a distraction. But the alternative, abandoning my father, felt like abandoning a part of myself. I realized then that my resentment towards Ralph was entwined with my resentment towards Douglas, towards the family secrets, towards my own past failures. I was so busy blaming them for my problems that I hadn't truly taken responsibility for my own choices, my own reactions. My resilience had always been a shield, a refusal to look inward. Now the shield was cracking. A month had passed since Ralph's stroke. Synapse AI was barely treading water. The server fees were overdue, the intern I'd been hoping to hire was off to a competing startup, and the grant application I'd poured weeks into had been rejected, citing a lack of demonstrable progress. My dream of personalized education was slowly dying, suffocated by hospital bills and the overwhelming demands of caregiving. Ralph, though still mostly unresponsive, had started to show flickers of awareness, a slight tremor of his hand, a fleeting opening of his eyes. The doctors called it a positive sign. I called it a cruel twist of the knife extending the agony. One afternoon, I was sitting by his bed, half-heartedly sketching out new UI designs on a notepad when a nurse came in carrying a small wooden box. "He was clutching this when they found him, Mr. Garcia," she said gently. "Must be important to him." The box was old, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, nestled amongst some brittle yellowed papers and a tarnished silver locket, was a small, crudely drawn star map. It wasn't the kind of precise astronomical chart I knew Ralph was capable of, but a child's drawing full of wobbly lines and mismatched constellations. On the back, in faint, elegant script, was a single phrase, "For my little explorer." And below it a date, the day of my 6th birthday. It was my asterisk drawing. My heart twisted. This was the map I'd given him, a fantastical journey to a made-up star system where we would discover new planets together. The locket, I realized with a jolt, was the one my mother had given him on their wedding day, a miniature portrait of a young, hopeful Sarah Garcia inside. He hadn't forgotten us. He hadn't truly abandoned us. He had carried these pieces of us with him even as he was lost to us. The twist was unexpected, profound. Ralph wasn't just a mysterious stranger, a source of shame. He was a man who had clearly carried his own burdens, his own silent grief, his own peculiar way of remembering. This wasn't the callous, unfeeling man Douglas had always painted. This was something else. A new layer of understanding began to form, challenging my long-held assumptions. The ghost was not an empty one. I went to Douglas' office that evening, the star map clutched in my hand. His office, unlike mine, was a shrine to academic success. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves overflowing with weighty tomes, framed awards gleaming on the wall, a pristine mahogany desk. He looked up from his laptop, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Alexander, I'm quite busy." I laid the star map on his desk. "This was in his things, Doug." He picked it up, his brow furrowed. His eyes scanned the child's drawing, then the inscription on the back. A tremor went through his hand, almost imperceptible. He looked up at me, his usual controlled expression cracking for the first time. He kept this. His voice was thin, reedy. "And Mom's locket," I added, pushing the locket across the desk. "He didn't forget us, Doug. He just disappeared." "What happened?" Douglas sat back, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "He was offered a position," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "A research opportunity, top secret, pioneering work in theoretical astrophysics. It was his lifelong dream, the kind of breakthrough he lived for. But it meant leaving everything, no contact, total secrecy. He was told it was for the good of the project, for national security, for humanity's progress." He agonized over it, Alexander, for weeks. He tried to tell Mom to explain, but she couldn't understand. She saw it as abandonment. And when she threatened to leave him if he took it, he chose the stars. Douglas' voice broke. "He told me. He begged me to look after Mom, to explain to you both when you were older, to make you understand that he loved us, but this was his destiny. He made me promise to never tell, for Mom's sake, to protect her from the pain of knowing he chose his work over her. He said she wouldn't survive the truth." He finally looked at me, his eyes brimming, "But she never recovered anyway. And I resented him for the burden he placed on me, for the lie I had to live, for the pain he caused. I resented you for your anger, for not understanding, for making things harder. I resented myself for not being able to protect you both better. I became what I thought our parents wanted, the perfect son, the academic success, as a way to prove that someone asterisk in the Miller name could be dependable, could achieve something great, could escape the chaos he created. I was so focused on being everything he wasn't, I forgot what he asterisk was. The weight of decades of unspoken truth, of carefully constructed facades, seemed to finally lift from his shoulders, revealing a raw, vulnerable man I had never seen. My overachieving sibling, the golden child, was just as broken as I was, just in a different way. He had been protecting us in his own misguided, painful way. And I, in my bitterness, had never bothered to ask for the full story, had perpetuated the very problem by holding on to my own version of the narrative. Douglas' revelation transformed everything. Ralph wasn't a callous monster, and Douglas wasn't merely a patronizing academic. They were both victims of a deeply flawed, impossibly complex situation, tangled in a web of love, duty, and sacrifice. The family secrets that had haunted me, that had driven my desperate need for success with Synapse AI as a means of escape, were finally laid bare. It wasn't about escaping the Miller name, it was about understanding it. 3 months later, Ralph had started physical therapy. He still couldn't speak, but his eyes followed me, and sometimes, if I placed a picture of a nebula in his hand, his grip would tighten ever so slightly. Synapse AI, against all odds, was slowly limping back to life. Douglas had started visiting Ralph not just as a duty but with a quiet, almost mournful tenderness. He'd bring him books on astrophysics, reading aloud about quantum mechanics and black holes, his voice gentle. He even offered to connect me with some of his former students who were looking for coding internships, students he described as brilliant, but perhaps a little unconventional, like yourself, Alexander. It wasn't a direct apology, but it was an olive branch, a quiet acknowledgement of my own worth, and a subtle shift in his perception of Synapse AI from a hobby to a potentially promising venture. Ruth, meanwhile, had blossomed into an invaluable asset. Her gossip network had morphed into an information pipeline, connecting me to student groups, campus resources, and even a small angel investor group that specialized in educational tech. She leveraged her contacts to secure a meeting with a dean who was intrigued by Synapse AI's potential to enhance student learning outcomes. "Professor Miller spoke highly of your project. By the way," Shed confided with a wink, indicating Douglas' subtle yet impactful support. "And I may have mentioned your recent family challenges. People like to invest in a good story, Alex, especially one with a resilient survivor at its heart." She still scrolled through her phone, but now it was often to send me links to articles on AI ethics or educational trends. She even started taking a few online courses in project management, surprising herself as much as me. The resolution wasn't a sudden Hollywood-esque triumph. Synapse AI was still struggling, but it had a pulse. Ralph was still recovering, but he was no longer a ghost, but a quiet, fragile presence, a reminder of the complex tapestry of family. Douglas and I were far from perfect siblings, but the unspoken resentments had given way to a fragile understanding, a shared burden of care, and a tentative bridge of respect. My own transformation was perhaps the most profound. The resentment and anger that had fueled my ambition had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose, a newfound humility. I was no longer running from the past or trying to prove myself to others. I was simply building not just a company but a new foundation for my life, one brick at a time, acknowledging the flaws and the strengths of the family name I carried. The weight hadn't completely lifted, but it had shifted, settling into a bearable, even meaningful part of who I was. The journey was still unfolding, full of complexities, but I was no longer alone, and I was finally looking forward, not back.